The Big Girl Feelings podcast contains explicit content that may be triggering for some listeners. Listener discretion is advised.
Sex, consensual non-monogamy, toxic masculinity, boundary setting, fat phobia. These are just a few on a very long list of topics considered taboo and stigmatized by our society. But not anymore. Through genuine, honest, and often uncomfortable conversations, we're running away from societal norms and sprinting toward living our authentic truth. This is the podcast where anything goes. I'm your host, Ashley, and we're here to talk about our big girl feelings. Welcome back to the Big Girl Feelings podcast, where we are redefining societal norms and shifting perspectives through uncomfortable conversations. I'm your host, Ashley, and back in the studio with me today is my friend, Ashley.
Hello.
You can call us the Ashleys. Today's topic is one that I hold very close to my heart and is a huge part of the reason why I started this podcast to begin with. Ashley, can you guess what that topic is?
Polyamory.
It's because she already knew. This episode is going to be partially educational. There's a lot of stigma attached to non-monogamous relationship types in general, and we're going to try to squash some of those stereotypes today and hopefully make you have a more open mind about it.
Absolutely. I definitely have a lot of questions myself as someone in a monogamous relationship, and hopefully I'll be asking the questions that, the folks have as well.
Yeah, I love that. And again, that's one of the reasons I think this works really well for us, because you're such an open-minded person, but you want to know things and you are so supportive of our relationship type. Obviously, you and Chris were some of the first people that Brent and I introduced Rebecca to.
Yep.
Because I knew that there would be no judgment. You would be happy for us and support us in any way that you could, and I was absolutely right. And that's the way it's been. This topic is very topical right now, because some of you probably already know, Brent, my husband, and I just proposed to our partner, Rebecca.
Yay! Congratulations!
It's really exciting. We gave her a beautiful ring, and we had our dogs involved as part of the proposal.
I immediately started Googling what kind of card to get. I don't know if Hallmark has it. I feel like they might. Etsy has my back.
Of course, Etsy has your back. Etsy always has everybody's back. Fun fact, I actually had Rebecca's ring custom made from an Etsy.
Ooh, okay.
Yeah. He did an amazing job. I'll probably link that either in the comments or in the
show notes.
Yeah. If anybody wants to check out his custom jewelry. She's very happy with her ring, and she's been showing it off, and it's been great, and we're planning a wedding for next year.
Awesome.
And of course, unfortunately, we can't get legally married as a throuple, and that is what we refer to ourselves as.
Okay.
If anybody was wondering, we've gotten that question quite a few times.
I know we used polycule, throuple.
For sure. They're kind of interchangeable,
yeah.
In a sense. Generally, if I say my polycule, I'm also including Kate in that.
Okay.
And if I'm referring to myself, Rebecca, and Brent's relationship, often we'll refer to ourselves as a throuple.
That does make sense to me.
Oh, good. I'm glad. And
sure.
I hope it makes sense to everybody else as well. And I'm always open to answer questions about that, of course. Non-monogamous relationship types tend to be pretty stereotyped in general, I think, within our society. In media, in a sense, it almost gets kind of made fun of or ridiculed in the media, and I don't think that creators always realize that they're doing that.
It can be like an easy punchline sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. That's an excellent way of putting it. We get stereotyped as, or non-monogamy gets stereotyped as, it's all about key parties and swingers and orgies, and all of that very much is a part of consensual non-monogamy. I wouldn't deny that. However, it's not the only type of consensual non-monogamy. And that's kind of where this episode is going. I kind of want to, go through the different types of consensual non-monogamy, specifically polyamory, and touch on all the different types and how they differentiate from each other. Consensual non-monogamy, I think, is on a spectrum, and I think I might have,
definitely
said that in the first episode. I think everything is on a huge spectrum, and consensual non-monogamy being no different. And that goes from compulsory monogamy all the way to the other end of spectrum, which I would say is where polyamory and completely open relationships lie. And then there are a whole other plethora of relationship types somewhere in the middle, and they're all valid. Wouldn't you agree, Ashley? What's your thoughts on that?
Definitely. I was wondering, should we start from what is polyamory versus what is monogamy?
Yeah,
kind of start super baseline and kind of explain what those words really mean.
I think it would be interesting to hear from your perspective. To you, what do those words mean?
Well, I guess like the quick answer would be like monogamy is choosing to be with one person in a romantic relationship and a sexual relationship only, whether that's a marriage or common law or some other version of that. It's just that two people want to be exclusively with each other versus polyamory, which I'm also learning like an open relationship is different than polyamory. So even that kind of stuff, I'm not quite sure exactly of the difference. So maybe we can get into that as well.
You know, I would say that that is the definition of monogamy.
Okay, perfect.
You know, I think relationships and relationship structures are so fluid, and that's something that people tend to forget a lot of the time. It's really funny because when Rebecca and I started dating, this was a very common conversation for us. We talked a lot about when Rebecca and I met, she thought she was straight.
Okay.
And she had been in a committed monogamous relationship for 6 years with the same person, with a cisgender male. And it was very interesting when we started dating to watch her adjust to this lifestyle and the challenges that brought us as a throuple as we tried to figure out all the key pieces and how that was all going to fit in together. Rebecca.
So maybe another question I have for you is, what is a throuple? Like, does that mean it's you and Rebecca and Brent? Becca? I have questions.
That's such a good question, and
I don't know that I know for sure what a throuple is. If I can be honest.
No, that's such a great question, and I bet you there are lots of people out there wondering the same thing. And what you just said is pretty accurate. A throuple or a triad, there's a couple of different words that are interchangeable for that.
I have been on the Reddit page. I saw a reference to a V formation. I don't know. It was overwhelming.
Of course you were on Reddit. It's very much, you know, the three of us are in an equal relationship. For all intents and purposes, we're 33.333% a part of this relationship.
Okay.
And it maybe didn't start out that way. Actually, let's just go back for a second. My relationship is a very good example of polyamory, of course. And I'm sure there are lots of people out there wondering how this all got started.
Sure.
And, you know. So just to go back, just as a little introduction to our relationship and how that came about. I met Rebecca, as I mentioned, through our dance community with the Arch Method. And we were in the same dance class. And at the time, as I mentioned, Rebecca was in a relationship with somebody else.
Okay.
And unfortunately, it didn't work out. Worked out for me, but... Yeah, we had hung out with Rebecca in a group setting a couple of times, and I had noticed what I thought was some chemistry between her and Brent.
Okay.
And that might come as a shock to a lot of people that I was the one who sort of encouraged that interaction between them. You know, we got in bed the night after we had all hung out in this group setting. And
you had kind of noticed and realized. So it was like, babe, I think you have the crush.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. So we were lying in bed and I just said, well, you know, Rebecca's kind of cute, right? And he's like, yeah, look, that was kind of weird. They had like a little flirty moment, you know, throughout the night. And I thought it was super cute. And I thought, hey, that might be a good opportunity for Brent. I hadn't had a partner in a while and I wasn't really looking for one at the time. We're not actively looking for partners. It's more about
if the right person comes along.
Exactly. You want to give yourself and your partner the space to explore that if it comes up.
Should it come up, right.
So in this particular case, I had encouraged Brent to reach out to Rebecca, and he did. And through the jigs and reels, they ended up hanging out. They hung out once on their own. And then the second time they hung out, she came to our place and we cooked her dinner.
Okay. And
one thing led to another. And the next thing we knew, I was there too. And that's like the long and short of it. And then Brent and I went on a vacation, and then Rebecca and I had been having lots of conversations while we were on vacation.
Yes, I remember that point.
And that's sort of how it got going.
Okay.
And then it's just history from there. The same way that any other relationship kind of progresses or evolves, we started spending more time together, getting to know each other better, and realizing that she was a really good fit for our relationship, and she was realizing the same thing. And at the beginning, it was a transition for her because she had not come out as queer.
Okay.
And honestly, we've had lots of conversations about this, and she really didn't even know that she was queer up until that point. And I think that's because it was more about the person falling for the person as
Fair
opposed
enough.
to, the sex, right?
Yeah.
So at the beginning, when Brent and I first decided that we were going to pursue this, we weren't really sure how she was going to fit in to our life. And we definitely, I think, had envisioned a more hierarchical type
like a
relationship.
primary partner
Exactly.
and a secondary.
Look at you
See,
using all that. Reddit's paying off. And there are polyamorous out there who will tell you that hierarchy in a polyamorous relationship is a big no-no, and there's lots of
Okay.
controversy about that, and that's not something that we're going to get into today. And I have my opinions on that, and I'm sure that you will and everybody else will. But the fact of the matter is, that's not what this ended up being. It ended up very much evolving into us having lots of productive conversations, and communication is everything. Communication is the key to every single relationship type that exists.
1,000%.
Family, friendships, relationships, and even more so when there are more people involved, right? It's
I
easier.
can only imagine. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's easier to have a conversation with two people. You add a third person into the mix, and that adds a different dynamic, and there are interpersonal relationships between all three parties. And luckily, and Rebecca says this all the time, Brent and I had already experimented with polyamory, so we were pretty versed, and we had lots and lots of conversations about it, and that made for an easier transition for her. And we were able to answer her questions, and we were able to, there was lots of reassuring her that she was valued and her opinion was valued in our relationship. And it would never be a case of trying to go behind her back or have conversations without her or anything like that.
I can definitely see like the worry there when you're joining people who are already married and like have history and everything else, like how that could be challenging.
Absolutely. And we knew that. And we encouraged her. Rebecca struggles a little bit with confrontation. I think a lot of people do. And we encouraged her to come forward when she was feeling insecure, if she ever had any of those sort of negative feelings. And of course, when you're going into a relationship like this, that's very much outside what society expects, and you start to be public about that, you're getting lots of questions from family and friends. And she had never had to feel these questions before, so there was a lot of trying to figure out how to respond to that type of communication from people outside of our relationship. You have to try to find a balance of coaching her on how to deal with that, but also not being an influence and letting her
not making the decision for
exactly
her.
letting
Yeah,
her
absolutely.
make her own decisions, letting her have her own feelings about it. And I've never seen a person grow as much as she has in the past year, and I'm so proud of her for that. And I'm hoping eventually I will be able to get her to come on the podcast and have a discussion with me. But in the meantime, we've discussed the podcast, and of course, because of the content, we've discussed the fact that her name was probably going to get brought up a lot. She was very comfortable with that, in case anybody was wondering. But I do hope that eventually she will come on and share her perspective, because I think that she has a lot of valuable things to say.
We'll get her on.
Absolutely.
I'm sure.
Absolutely. So one of the things that I wanted to touch on, the different types, I guess, of consensual non-monogamy and how that compares to monogamy or compulsory monogamy. Let's start with compulsory monogamy. We've used that term on the show a couple times now. I've had a couple people, just friends and family, in passing ask what it meant. So I just want to clarify that for everybody now so everyone has an idea, because I will be using that term quite a bit. So you just defined monogamy for everyone. When we refer to compulsory monogamy, we're talking about the way that monogamy is presented to us from a super young age.
Almost like the obligation of
Exactly.
to participate in normal society. It's expected of you.
For sure.
That's what you'll do.
We all know the age-old story, right? Boy meets girl, girl falls in love with boy, they get married, they have children, they live in a nuclear family and with a white picket fence and so on. And that's a lovely picture. And for anybody out there that's living that exact picture, I am so genuinely happy for you. If you are happy in your life, I truly am so genuinely happy for you. I don't judge anybody. Just because I choose an alternative lifestyle for myself doesn't mean that I judge anybody else.
Of course, absolutely. That's not where you're coming from at all.
Not at all. And I think there are lots of positives to monogamy, and I think that it is a very valid lifestyle for a lot of people. My counter to that is that there are a lot of people out there who are living a monogamous lifestyle, not that they're living it against their will, because that's not what I'm trying to get at here.
Maybe they've never had the space to examine if it's really for them.
Exactly. This is some interesting stats that I came across. So 1 in 5 people in North America have experimented with non-monogamy. Is that surprising to you, Ashley?
It's not super surprising to me. It's definitely not my experience, but it's not super shocking to me, I don't think.
Right. And I think
it may be to others, though, certainly.
For sure. I would say that I am surprised that people admitted to that, but I think it's more so that people are willing to admit to that. And if they know it's an anonymous quiz or an anonymous study that they're participating in, they're much more likely to be honest about their answers. So I think that's an interesting dynamic to think about.
I think also the way you phrase that question too can have a lot to do with how people answer it as well. I think if you ask them, hey, would you try polyamory? Maybe people would say no because they might not know what it is, right, or etc. But if you word it in a different way, perhaps maybe they would react more favorably to it.
Right, that's a good point. The other stat that I wanted to share is 1 in 3 people in North America admitted that non-monogamy would be their ideal relationship structure.
And I think here on this question, especially the way you word it, I think you could get some really interesting answers.
I think so,
right?
too. Yeah, I think so too. It's a little bit of food for thought regarding how people truly feel about non-monogamy, or ethical non-monogamy as we like to refer to it. I want to be clear about something, and having been in this exact situation, having been on the bad side of infidelity, I think it's really important for me to clarify on this. In no way, shape, or form would I ever condone infidelity. I wouldn't. I've been on the receiving end of that, and it fucking sucks. And that is a very, very different thing than consensual non-monogamy.
Yeah, cheating generally is not communicated beforehand.
No, exactly.
If you have that kink, that's one thing. But
but yeah, cheating is, let's say it for the people in the back. Cheating, not consensual non-monogamy. Very,
not
very
okay.
much non-consensual. Not okay. Compulsory monogamy is interesting because even though it sounds like it has negative connotations, and it does, I guess, at least from my perspective, that's not to say that it can't lead to happy, healthy relationships. But it can also lead to a lifetime of feeling trapped and a lifetime of feeling unhappy. And I have seen that firsthand.
Absolutely. I think if something is not fulfilling you, you shouldn't do that thing.
Yeah.
Whatever it may be. It can be hard to get out of things, but I think it goes back to you talking about living your authentic life, right? Like if you're not doing that and it's soul crushing, how can you get out of that, basically?
Right.
Right.
Exactly. You know, monogamy at its core,
it sounds so much like monotony.
It does. And there may be some
for some.
Yeah, there may be something to be said about that. But you know, monogamy just by its virtue is a made up construct, right? It is. And that's not meant to be a negative point. It just is. I mean, everything really is a made up construct.
Everything's made up.
Right. Everything. But monogamy was originally a made up construct as a way to enforce gender roles and social order. And a lot of people don't think about it that way because monogamy, just like any other relationship structure, is fluid and it evolves. And it has evolved so much over the past couple of thousand years. And there's a lot of history there. And of course, we don't have time in one episode to go back through the entire history. But in general, throughout history, monogamy actually takes up a very small part of our timeline on being the most common relationship structure.
Let's touch maybe on some of the history of monogamy and non-monogamy. What did that look like throughout the years?
That's a really good question, and there are a lot of really good resources, and I will touch on some main points here in our conversation, but I will also leave some resources for people, for anyone who...
Give us some stuff to Google.
Yeah, for anyone who wants to delve a little further into it. It is a very interesting topic. Even if you're monogamous, it's just really interesting to look back throughout history, and
it's fascinating to see how others lived and lived before us and how others are living now.
Exactly. You know, like monogamy, marriage, which I think kind of is synonymous with monogamy, marriage is also a made-up construct. And again, I don't mean to add negative connotations to that, because I am married and I very much value my marriage to
When
Brent.
you got married, it was with the intention to be monogamous with Brent? ?
Yeah, actually, that's an excellent question. And I don't know that I ever really thought of it that way. I don't know if I ever actively thought that,
It's more like, I love this person, I want to spend my life with them, however that may look, and yes, I'll be loyal to them.
And like I said, everything is open to evolving. Everything is open to changing.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's the status quo for a reason. It's societal constructs that you also feel that you have to participate in.
Right. No, absolutely. And even somebody like me, who maybe has always been a little more ahead of the curve in that area, though, they still creep in and they still get me, and there are still things that I'm trying to overcome and that I question and go back and forth with inside my brain every single day, wondering if I'm making the right move. I mean, even doing this podcast, I'm very passionate about it, but that doesn't mean that I don't question if I'm making the right choice. Is it too early? Are people ready to hear this kind of content? Like, those kinds of thoughts go through your head all the time.
Of course, every decision one makes.
Absolutely. And if you're not making a thoughtful decision, then chances are you're not making a good decision. I think everything, no matter how sure we are of it, there needs to be a thought process behind it. You need to be introspective and think about how that decision is going to affect you and the people around you. And
definitely. And I think you're trying to provoke new questions for people.
Totally.
With this conversation and overall podcast.
Totally. You asked about the history of monogamy and the history of polyamory. Polyamory is a term that really only came into use in the past 30-ish years, early 90s, maybe late 80s.
Okay.
I think I touched on this in the first episode, but the word polyamory, it has Latin and Greek roots that translate to loving many. That just means that when you're in a polyamorous relationship, whether you're actively polyamorous or not, you allow yourself the space to love other people, to make connections, meaningful connections with other people. Now, I don't say that to take away from true love and soulmates, because honestly, I kind of do believe in all of that stuff. I just believe that we're not limited to one soulmate. Mm-hmm. And I don't judge anybody who does think that, anybody who believes that they have found and married their soulmate and they're truly happy. I just love love.
Right.
In all its forms. I think that every relationship we have, no matter if it's with a friend, a family member, a partner, they're all equally important. And any values that I bring to my relationship with my partners, I also think those values are important. I think that respect and communication, all of that is so important. If you and I were having a conversation about something.
Absolutely, even amongst friends.
Right.
Those things matter.
Exactly. And I think that friendship breakups are a real thing, especially in adulthood, the way that they affect us. They may not affect us as much when we're younger, when we're children or adolescents or teenagers even, but they're very, very difficult in adulthood
to navigate.
And
we're almost not taught how to deal with that.
We're not, because people put a hierarchy on relationships.
Right.
And
the only one that matters is your marriage, for example.
Exactly. I think that as a society, we definitely put that at the top of the triangle for relationships and how they should be treated.
And how they should be prioritized.
Right. Exactly. I personally think that friendship counseling should be a thing, and maybe it is. I think there probably is some of that happening in the world, and if not, there's certainly a market for it, and if not, there certainly should be a market for it. from a biological perspective, most species don't participate in monogamy. And actually, monogamy only became the prevailing relationship structure just a couple of hundred years ago. Like, I don't think people realize that. For that, you are hard-pressed to find monogamy in history. During the Roman Empire, I mean, everybody was fucking everybody. There are still tribes today that raise their children as a family. Everyone chips in. Women are having sex with multiple partners, and any male that participates, we'll say, is considered a father to the child, and is
active in raising that child,
and is active in raising that child. And I'm not saying that that is the solution, right? That every female should go out and get railed by 7 or 8 dudes, and they should all live in a compound, and it's just
that may not be for you.
And I mean, that's not for me either, right? But I just want to give people an idea of how recently monogamy became a construct and how recently marriage became a construct. And of course, marriage then was sort of...
Well, marriage, I think a lot of that was about being property.
It was absolutely marriage,
ownership.
Absolutely. And then of course religion got brought into it, and especially Catholicism. And I'm not going to voice my opinions on religion right now on the podcast. I have them. This is not the episode for it, but religion absolutely does play a factor into marriage and how it evolved. I want to make a point to say that monogamy and love are not necessarily the same thing. And I think that that's what a lot of people get confused.
Okay.
I think that a lot of people who end up in monogamous relationships, we see it all the time, are not happy. And I'm sure there are lots of people out there who practice consensual non-monogamy who are also not happy. I'm not here to say that one is better than the other. I'm not here to say that everybody should pick up a couple of extra partners and that's how everyone should be living their life. But I do believe that we are psychologically welded to believe in monogamy and to believe that it is the
be all and end all.
Yeah.
The only option.
Exactly. And I could give you 1,000 of examples of how that rings true for me from a young age, and I bet you could come up with a couple hundred other examples.
Barbie and Ken.
Exactly.
Off the top of my head.
Yeah. I mean, the quintessential example, am I right?
Mm-hmm.
You know? That's not to say that people who are monogamous can't truly be in love, because I was in a monogamous relationship with Brent for years before we took a third partner, before either of us took other partners. But they also aren't necessarily always mutually exclusive. I think that a lot of people, and I think this is particularly true for the boomer generation, I think they have what I like to call learned love. Obviously, nuclear families and marriage and everything was especially important to that generation.
And definitely expected of them.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that a lot of the pressure on our generation as millennials comes from that, because we have boomer parents, right?
Of course.
Boomers, they left their homes. Most of them came from homes where they had 15 or 16 brothers and sisters. I know, like, my dad had 14 brothers and sisters. It was crazy. My mom had 7. And
my dad comes from a large family as well.
I think that was pretty common. Again, it goes back to my grandparents, for example, owned a sawmill.
Mm-hmm.
And they pumped out kids, and the kids all worked at the sawmill, and it was great. And it was during a time when money was scarce, and it was post-war, and we were in a Great Depression, and just all kinds of factors that made sense at the time. And then boomers would leave their parents' house, they'd go to school, they'd start a government job or whatever type of job, and they met somebody, and they got married, and they had children, and they had a nuclear family, and they worked, and then they retired, and that was how they lived their lives. And that was very normal for them. But I don't feel like that family structure necessarily carries through very well into our generation.
I think a lot of it isn't within reach for millennials either, like to purchase a home and, you know, have a wife that stays at home or something like that. That just isn't really possible for a lot of our peers, I think.
That is a really good point. And that goes back to what we said about, you know, monogamy as a construct was used as a way to enforce gender roles and to keep social order. And I think in a sense it still does, you know? I just want to touch on polygamy for a minute and what that means in comparison to polyamory.
Yeah, let's talk about some of the different relationship structures that are out there. It's not just polyamory or monogamy.
No, it isn't. So polygamy, of course, is the...
We all know polygamy from Sister Wives, or at least I do. That's one of my, very guilty pleasure shows.
That actually brings us to a good point, because I think a lot of people get their only embrace with non-traditional relationship structures from shows like that.
They're getting a very extreme example of what relationships outside of monogamy can look like.
Right, because I will say there are some really good movies, some really good documentaries and stuff, and I will link some of those later about polyamory and about consensual non-monogamy. But the majority of media that we're digesting in our generation about non-traditional relationship structures comes from shows like Big Love. That's going to lead us into a very interesting discussion about polygamy. For anyone who doesn't know, polygamy is illegal. It's outlawed in Canada and the US. But the reason that it's outlawed comes very much from the Mormon Church. Back in the mid 1900s, a religious commune was established in BC. And it was established by a small minority of preachers who had been expelled from the Mormon Church. Because the leader of the Mormon Church had disavowed polygamy. They didn't agree with the decision, so they started their own sort of branch of the Mormon Church.
They broke off and started their own thing.
Exactly. In 1985, one of the extremist preachers who had been expelled from the original Mormon Church, a man named Winston Blackmore, became the leader of this new fundamentalist group. They were shipping young girls as young as 10 years old, on average around the ages of 12 to 13, across the border into Utah, into some of the more northern states. The RCMP started an investigation in the early 90s, and that investigation went on for a long time, and there's lots of history, lots of records about it online if anybody is interested in reading the full story, and it is a very interesting story. I will say that it could be triggering, so please proceed with caution if you do want to look into that. But essentially, those men, the extremists, ended up...
they were what were they charged by the RCMP?
Exactly. They ended up getting charged. The Supreme Court ruled that polygamy was dangerous to the communities.
So the men end up getting charged, and then the case is brought up so far as to the Supreme Court of Canada.
Exactly. And in 2011, the Supreme Court upheld the law and determined that polygamy would indeed stay
as illegal in Canada.
And their reasoning for it was that they found the harm against women and children outweighed concerns over protecting religious freedom. Around the same time, the Supreme Court also determined that polyamory would not be included in that law, which is a win for polyamorous, of course, everywhere. The pickle that we find ourselves in now is that because polygamy is considered a crime in Canada, people like myself, Brent, and Rebecca can't get legally married because of an outdated, antiquated rule, and there needs to be some balance, right? There has to be... There's a far cry between three people who are genuinely in love and want that recognized and want to be able to share in the same advantages and even disadvantages that monogamous couples find themselves in, and a couple of rapey preachers who want to marry 15, 12-year-old girls and pop out children for the sake of pushing their religious agenda.
So what was the purpose, or what exactly is the Supreme Court of Canada covering or saying by making the distinction versus polygamy versus polyamory? Are they offering protections to polyamorous people?
So my understanding is that, and this actually came up because 3 people in Newfoundland who consider themselves a triad, same as us, they had a child.
Okay.
And they wanted protection for all 3 parents, and that ended up going to the Supreme Court because they couldn't get any satisfaction from the provincial court, and the court ended up
deciding in the family's favor.
Yeah, they gave parental rights to all 3 guardians, and that was a huge win for us. And of course, we're always 10 or 20 or 30 years behind when it comes to human rights. But I think that's something we need to champion for. We have accepted that our wedding is going to look like a traditional wedding from the standpoint of Rebecca will wear a white dress and we will have a dinner and we'll have a first dance and like all that. But from a legal perspective, we can only have a commitment ceremony. And that's unfair, you know, at the end of the day. And that's a whole other episode to get into. I just wanted to touch on it. But I want to read this quote from the judge. And it's from Justice Robert Fowler, and this is from a CBC article about the family that I was just discussing with the parental rights. He said, "Society is continuously changing, and family structures are changing along with it. This must be recognized as a reality and not as a detriment to the best interests of the child." And I just think that that's such a powerful statement, and that is absolutely the trajectory that we need to be on in society to protect all relationship structures. And there needs to be some common sense used, obviously, right? You know, I understand the reasons these laws were put in place to begin with, but I just think that we need to keep evolving and keep growing. Nothing stays the same. And so I hope that
the laws can catch up.
Yeah, I hope eventually the laws catch up. It's more than we can say in one episode. But just to go back to polyamory being on a spectrum, you know, like I said, there's a difference in being polyamorous and being in an open relationship. And I don't think people always realize that. Whenever they see that Brent, Rebecca, and I are in a throuple, I think they automatically just think we're like going to key parties and out having orgies all the time. And like, that's not necessarily the case, right?
Right.
I'm not saying that there's
You're
anything
not saying no,
but I want to point out that polyamory means one very specific thing. Being in an open relationship means another very specific thing. And while both can be true at the same time, they're not mutually exclusive. Being in an open relationship can mean a lot of different things for a lot of different people. And it's all about what the parties in your particular situation want and need. Any opinions outside of that truly just don't fucking matter. That was a big topic of conversation with Rebecca when she first joined our relationship, trying to adjust to not caring what people think because, of course, it's different for people. And so, you know, they have a lot of questions, and I think rightfully so, but they also have a lot of opinions. And Rebecca and I talked a lot at the beginning, especially when she was coming out as bisexual, about what that meant for her. She always thought that she had to fit into a box, you know, and that being bisexual meant that she had to encompass everything that came along with that. And I explained this to her, and I think it rings true for polyamory and for open relationships as well. She can be whatever kind of bisexual woman she wants to be, and the only people that affects and the only people's opinions that matter are mine, hers, and Brent's. And anyone's opinion outside of that just doesn't matter. There are many, many different types of open relationships. You have people who are both partners, are on Tinder, they're both regularly sleeping with other people. That doesn't mean that they don't have an amazing, healthy relationship at home. And I think that's the stigma that most people need to get over. I think people have this like vision of an open relationship and think that it's used as a...
Maybe one person isn't satisfying the other one or isn't enough for them. I think people can judge it like that.
I also know of cases where one person's asexual and the other person isn't. And those two people are still very much in love and they have an emotional connection, but they just don't have a sexual connection.
Mm-hmm. And that's nobody's business but their own.
Exactly. It isn't. There are also people who just do it for the hell of it. There's a huge swinging community in St. John's, and of course people don't necessarily know about it because the people who are engaging in those communities often feel like they need to hide it. And often they're people from all walks of life, everywhere from convenience store workers to retail workers to doctors, lawyers, dentists, judges. Everyone has needs and has interests, and they just want to live their lives, right? They just want to live their authentic lives and do what they want to do and be happy. I mean, we only get one frickin' life, you know? And that's something that we're going to go down a rabbit hole on in a future episode, I'm sure. With that said, we're going to roll right into our question of the week. This was actually a two-part question. I'm going to answer the second part of the question now. And the first part we're going to save for episode 4 because the question was, how do you deal with or prevent jealousy in a polyamorous relationship. And episode 4 happens to be all about jealousy in all different types of relationships. So I'm going to leave that part of the question to answer in episode 4. The second part of the question was, can one person be monogamous in a relationship and another have multiple partners? And I'm going to answer that with a resounding yes. The correct term for a relationship of that structure is monopoly, and it's exactly what you said. One person in the relationship is monogamous and the other one is either polyamorous or open. And it's all about what is comfortable for the parties involved. Polyamorous relationships, open relationships can look so many different ways, as I've mentioned many times. And this is just one way that it can look. And that could be for a multitude of different reasons. And as long as the person who is monogamous is okay with that, and they have given permission to this other person, and there are very clear boundaries set, then yes, that is absolutely a valid relationship structure. I'm going to touch on that more in a future episode, but I hope that answers your question for now. That is just about going to do it for our second episode. I just want to take this opportunity again to thank every single person who has been listening in. I am just absolutely overwhelmed. We all are with all of the positive feedback we've been getting. We're loving all your questions, all your comments, all your topic suggestions. So please keep them coming. Now, you bunch of perverts, next week we are going to be finally discussing sex. And I know you all want to know how we fuck. Don't even try to lie about it. So, spam me with your questions, all your spicy, naughty questions, and we will answer as many as we can next week. We won't just take one question, we will take multiple.
And we're all about multiples over here.
we sure are. And on that note, have a great week, and I can't wait for you all to join me next week as we have an uncomfortable conversation about sex.
Thank you for listening to the Big Girl Feelings podcast. Production and editing by Chris Ballard. Cover art by Jerry Stamp. Follow us on social media. You can find us at Big Girl Feelings on Instagram. Do you have questions for us, topic suggestions, stories you'd like to share? Email us at ashley@biggirlfeelings.com. Our podcast is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere else you listen to podcasts. If you're enjoying the show, please rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts.